Hello, everyone. I'm Mark Albus, and I will be talking about questions on the origin of diphthongs in Vietnamese and Vietic, and possible influence from Chinese. Uh, the scope of my talk will start from my article last year in the Ferlus tribute volume, the late Michel Ferlus, in which I analyzed vowels of early Chinese loanwords in Vietnamese, that is, words borrowed before the literary Sino-Vietnamese layer, and I noted many early Chinese loanwords borrowed with diphthongs. But there are no identifiable phonological conditioning factors for diphthongs in Vietnamese. Ferlus suggested it was maybe due to dialectal variation, the A versus US, such as we'll see a little bit later. But basically, the question for my talk is, why does Vietnamese have diphthongs? How do they emerge? What is the history of diphthongs in Vietic more broadly? And what role has language contact played in their development? And of course, I'll be talking about the Chinese loanwords, but there's also the spread of these diphthongs um, through Vietic. Now, I have some starting hypotheses because some of the data is pretty clear, but many details of questions remain. So for the data sources, of course, we start with Vietic lexical data and reconstructions of the phonological system and of both Proto-Vietic and Proto-Vietnamese, of those researchers noted here. And for Chinese reconstructions, I'll be paying attention mostly to later Han Chinese of Schussler and early Middle Chinese of Polyblank, and sometimes referring to the Xiaoxietang Chinese dialect database, and about 120 early Chinese loanwords in Vietnamese with diphthongs from my 2025 article. And that number 120, notice that, we'll come back to that. I will be expanding on the article and additionally consider Vietic and Vietnamese languages more broadly, and I will look a little bit more at the literary Sino-Vietnamese layer connected to late Middle Chinese, that is, after the early Chinese loanword period. So the starting point is the diphthongs in reconstructions, and Vedic is an Austroasiatic language, and in Proto-Austroasiatic, diphthongs have been reconstructed, even back to Shorto's work on Austroasiatic. But in Proto-Vedic, the phoneme inventory, there are only monophthongs, no diphthongs in the available reconstructions. But Ferlus, in his lexical reconstructions of Vietic, reconstructed about a dozen Proto-Vietic words with diphthongs. But his work at that time was not complete. It was definitely uh, uh, substantial, but quite a bit of unfinished work. We'll look at those a little bit more. And for suddenly in Proto-Vietnamese, we have ia, and ua. Those are, we must reconstruct those because, as I will show, both Vietnamese and various Hmong lexs have those. But these are not directly connected to the Proto-Austroasiatic etymma, that is, in almost not always, except for one instance, coming from ia in Proto-Austroasiatic or ua from ua. So where did they come from? Now, to give a little bit of context, I first want to point out that Vietic data shows a split between the Vietmung group, the more innovative one, with widespread diphthongization of Proto-Vietic and Proto-Austroasiatic monophthongs, and versus the Ponghui and disyllabic Southwest languages, which are more conservative. They retain the monophthongs of Proto-Vietic and Proto-Austroasiatic. Nevertheless, in a study I published a few years ago, 10 Vedic languages, all of them have at least 3 diphthongs, ia, ua, and ua. But in the non-Vietmung lexicons, words with diphthongs are much rarer, and almost all are not Proto-Austroasiatic or Proto-Vedic etymma. That is, they retain those monophthongs in those, and the diphthongs occur in loans, lexical loans, or innovations. Okay, so let's look back at those 14 of Ferlus's Vietic lexical reconstructions with diphthongs. And remember, there is ia, and ua. And therefore, he reconstructs with the ia diphthongs, and you can see those two in red, and those seem reasonable, although we could still debate the details. For example, Riet here actually is only attested in Vietnamese and no other Vietic language. It's just not available for some reason. But the other two are from Middle Chinese or later Han Chinese. These are Chinese loanwords, and so they don't actually date to Proto-Vietic, and we can exclude those from actual native Proto-Vietic vocabulary. There are three diphthongs, three with the diphthongs ua, and but only one of these is native. One is from early Middle Chinese, and then this one is PVC, which means Proto-Viet Minh Bong Cui, and that means it is not attested in the disyllabic Southwest languages, and so we cannot reconstruct it to Proto-Vietic with high confidence. It's possible, but it is also possible that it is an innovation at a later stage. Similarly, of the seven diphthongs with uh, two of these appear to be valid Proto-Vietic, and some, if it goes back to Proto-Austroasiatic, then we can reconstruct it in Proto-Vietic. But some of these are loan words, such as from Dai or from later Han, or pineapple is just something that came over with part of the colonial era goods and products. And and then there are two which are these Proto-Viet Minh Bong Cui types, so we don't know for sure that they are Proto-Vietic. So what does this mean? Of these 14 Proto-Vietic reconstructions of Fairluz's, most are loanwords or are limited to Viet Minh Bong Cui, meaning they are later, likely later innovations. And so what we have left are only 5 items, 8 if we include those 3 Proto-Viet Minh Bong Cui ones, versus 120 early Chinese loanwords with diphthongs. That's a significant difference, and we have to pay attention to that. Also limited, the non-Viet Minh Vietic languages have diphthongs in non-Proto-Vietic or Proto-Austroasiatic Adam. I'll talk about that in another slide, but most of them retain monophthongs in these etymia. So something else is going on. It's not a typical situation. Diphthongs, why did this happen? Well, the first thing I can say is that it looks like diphthongs developed earlier in Chinese than in Vietnamese. So at the stage of Proto-Vietic and early Old Chinese, it looks like there were either no diphthongs or limited numbers of diphthongs. And of course, the Old Chinese reconstructions vary, but as you'll see in the data I present, all of the reconstructions have monophthongs. But in later Han Chinese and early Middle Chinese, there are diphthongs reconstructed, and we can always challenge those reconstructions, but we know that some kind of vowel mutations occurred between Old Chinese and Middle Chinese. That's what the evidence looks reasonably so. The details, of course, devil's in the details. But only in Viet Minh, as we noted, do we see reconstructions of diphthongs. So it looks like kind of a sequence in which the diphthongs in Chinese predate those in Vietic. And then suddenly we see them in Viet Minh, and along with these loanwords from this early period, Chinese loanwords from this early period. So let's look at some of those. And early Chinese loanwords in Vietnamese, we'll look at those with ia. Again, for each of the ia, and ua, there are approximately 40. Varies according to the diphthong, and I will just pick out a few. And so zieng, zieng, miu, yeah, for these early Chinese loanwords, pretty well established early Chinese loanwords, the consonants and tones are expected for this early Chinese period. In addition, now we can say that it looks like these diphthongs may have been retained from this stage of borrowing for all of these in the early Middle Chinese and later Han Chinese, these bolded items here. Okay, but in Old Chinese, only monophthongs. In Ua, similarly, we have Vu, Rung, Vuong for these early Chinese loanwords in Vietnamese with diphthongs, and the early Middle Chinese and later Han varieties have those diphthongs. We could debate whether Dua with a U matches the reconstructions here, which neither of which have oo. One has oo and one has e as the core of the diphthong, but um, it's hard to imagine that dua was not a Chinese loanword, as this Zhu word has been borrowed in various languages throughout the region, and it matches uh, pretty well. In any case, that's it looks like these early Chinese loanwords were borrowed with diphthongs and retained. Here are a few which have diphthongs in Vietnamese, but not in later Han Chinese. So Schussler didn't reconstruct diphthongs for these, but in early Middle Chinese, they mostly have diphthong-like sequences, oo plus wa, kind of an off glide. I'm not sure exactly what Pulley Blanks had in mind for those. I should check that, but I don't know. But you can see how we might have ended up with diphthongs, a kind of reanalysis of the oo w um, sequence. Finally, we have these words here, rung, zung, rung, chua, kui, and we see again diphthongs in those earlier stages, and we see the oo back vowel, or sort of close to back unrounded, or mid-high unrounded. That's fine, but how about native vocabulary? So let's look at some Viet Minh native words with diphthongs, but some of them have monophthongs from the Proto-Vedic stage. So let's look at these here. In this table, you can see this column has Vietnamese words, and all of these, Thuong, Muon, Buc, Uong, all have diphthongs. In Proto-Vietic, you can see all of these have these red monophthongs, these red vowels here are all monophthongs. And similarly, for the non-Viet Minh Vietic languages, are also almost entirely, I don't even know if I could find any diphthongs there. They are retained as monophthongs. But in Hmong, when we see this column here, a little mixture of red and green, the Hmong Lex, and that means 30 lects from Nguyen Van Thuy's 2005 publication. We see some of which all have diphthongs, like Vietnamese. Um, However, some of them all, for some of them, all of them have monophthongs, unlike Vietnamese, kind of retention. And then in other cases, there's a mixture. And some of the Hmong Lex have these diphthongs innovated, and whilst others have retained that. And so we can see Hmong as being sort of intermediary between these two stages here. But indeed, the Viet Minh group has these diphthongs quite solidly, but these are not Chinese. These are all native words. So what about those non-Viet Minh languages? So we can look at, we know, I mentioned it before that some of them are loan words, some loan words with diphthongs in Vong Cui and the Southwest Vietic languages. And so some examples here from Ruk, Rem, Mai, and Cui. Here, these words here all have those red diphthongs, and these are almost undoubtedly uh, loans from Vietnamese. Now, even though they come from Chinese, this Sino-Vietnamese here, these two, Thuyen and Thuong, and then Tui is the early Chinese loan word versus the Sino-Vietnamese, which is Tui. And then there's this word, which is just a Vietnamese word. In all cases, these words have been borrowed, and these may have contributed, of course, to the phonemic inventory when you collect and describe the languages and say, oh, well, they have diphthongs. Well, these are loan words. Okay, so these borrowings from Vietnamese are among those which have diphthongs in those conservative Vedic languages. Um, Now there are words in the non-Vietnamese Vedic lex with diphthongs, but many of them are not, almost all are not Proto-Vedic etyma. So in these examples here from these languages, these Vedic, conservative Vedic languages, all of these have diphthongs, but as far as I can tell, none of these are Proto-Vedic native words. I don't know if they might have been borrowed from something else, but I don't think they have been. So what we're looking at, there are not many of these. It's difficult to find. It's a very small percentage, and I don't know the exact percentage yet. I haven't checked, but not many have diphthongs. But and some of them, as I mentioned, are loanwords, but some appear to be innovations. So we have both of these. And how do we account for those innovations? That's interesting. So lastly, I'll look at rates of Vietnamese syllables with diphthongs that are of Sino-Vietnamese origin. That is the late Middle Chinese layer after early Middle Chinese. James Kirby and I did a study, published a study a few years ago, in which we looked at about 8,000 distinct phonological syllables in Vietnamese and did some statistical analysis and such. And for those with ia, ua, and ua, there are about a little more than 1,000 of them. And as you can see here, many of them are native, but a good number are have Sino-Vietnamese counterparts. Let's put it that way. Some of them might have both native and non-native, Sino-Vietnamese origins. But as you can see, ia weighs heavy here, while weighs not too many instances there, just 9. But about 1/3 of these are have diphthongs from with diphthongs are from Sino-Vietnamese. But what's interesting is the Chinese dialect counterparts to these Sino-Vietnamese items rarely have diphthongs. So they have diphthongs, even though they're not diphthongs in varieties of Chinese. So how does this happen? And I don't yet know the answer, and I don't think anyone does. So what are some concluding observations, hypotheses, and questions? So some observations are both early Chinese loanwords and Sino-Vietnamese words appear to have contributed tremendously to the number of words with diphthongs in Vietnamese, in Munglex, and in some cases, the more conservative Vietic languages, but through Vietnamese, so not directly from Chinese. But it includes some of those early Chinese loanwords in Vietnamese or Sino-Vietnamese loanwords in Vietnamese. Second, the numbers of words with diphthongs, including the native words, have grown greatly in number among the Viet Minh languages, but not so much in other subbranches of Vietic. Okay, so for a hypothesis, I will say that Chinese loanwords brought diphthongs into the Northeast Vietic phonemic inventory, or I should say phonemic inventories, not just Vietnamese, of course. Once diphthongs became part of these phonemic inventories, they were readily available to create new words with those sounds. And this could happen as well in gradually in the conservative languages, Bangui and the Southwest Vietic languages. But uh, what about register and developments in vowels, which is a common phenomenon among Austroasiatic languages? No evidence of this is found in Vietnamese, but some evidence shows register-based impact on vowels in conservative Vedic languages, such as Malayan. But when did that happen? And where else in Vedic can this register-induced diphthongization be shown? So the situation is not yet explained, but it looks like Chinese definitely played a significant role, but then sort of takes on a life of its own as it becomes part of the phonemic inventories. Here are my references, and you can download this PowerPoint slide online. Thank you for your time.